It wasn't the bullet that killed him. The first shot, it tore through his throat. Survivable. He was still conscious, still breathing. But he couldn't fall down. Because 3 months before Dallas, at a private Hollywood party, John F. Kennedy re-injured his back in a bedroom. And that injury forced him, on the morning of November 22nd, to lace on a rigid back brace so tight it ran from his hips all the way past his chest. That brace held him perfectly upright after the first bullet hit. And Lee Harvey Oswald had time to fire again. What if Kennedy had simply not worn the brace that day? What if the most powerful man on Earth had lived? What if Camelot, the myth, the magic, the legend, had never been born? Today, we answer that question. And what we find will destroy everything you thought you knew. The world remembers John F. Kennedy as a golden god, young, vital, magnetic. The reality was something else entirely. By the time Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, he had already received last rites. Twice. He had Addison's disease, a failure of the adrenal glands that could shut down your body under extreme stress. The kind of stress that comes with, say, a nuclear standoff with the Soviet Union. He had chronic ulcers, degenerative disc disease so severe that 4 spinal surgeries had failed to fix it. His doctors privately described him as patently unhealthy. And he was being injected regularly with a cocktail of amphetamines, hormones, and stimulants by a man the press knew as Dr. Feelgood. His real name was Max Jacobson. He also treated Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, and Truman Capote. He would eventually lose his medical license. This was the man holding the nuclear codes. But it gets darker. In 1960, Frank Sinatra introduced Kennedy to a woman named Judith Campbell. She was beautiful, charming. She was also the mistress of Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago Mafia. Kennedy began an affair with her. She visited the White House repeatedly. And according to Senate investigators, she was carrying packages between the President of the United States and the most dangerous mob boss in America. The same mob boss whose influence over Chicago voters had helped Kennedy win the 1960 election. This was Camelot, the version the cameras never showed you. November 22nd, 1963, 7:10 in the morning. Kennedy dresses in his hotel suite in Fort Worth, Texas. His doctor had been urging him for months to stop wearing the brace. The rigid corset was weakening his muscles, causing dependency. Kennedy reportedly told him, "When I get back from Dallas, I'll get out of the brace, but I've got to wear it for this trip. I've got to look good." He laced it tightly, pulled a thick elastic bandage around his torso in a figure 8. The corset ran from his lower spine all the way up past his chest. At 12:30 p.m., his motorcade turns onto Elm Street in Dallas, Texas. 12:30 and 7 seconds. The first shot. It enters the back of his shoulder, exits through his throat. The governor beside him collapses, doubling forward. Kennedy's body does not move. The brace, rigid, unyielding, holds him perfectly upright. 5.6 seconds pass. The second shot. Now, what do we know about the man who pulled that trigger? 7 weeks before Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald traveled to Mexico City. He visited the Soviet embassy. He visited the Cuban embassy. And he sat across a table from a KGB officer named Valery Kostakov. Kostakov did not work in standard intelligence. He worked in Department 13. the Soviet unit dedicated specifically to assassination operations. The CIA had surveillance on that embassy. They recorded the meeting. They identified Oswald. And they did nothing. 2 days after the assassination, before Oswald could speak a single word in a courtroom, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby walked into a Dallas police station and shot him dead. The CIA director, John McCone, reviewed the intelligence files and told the new president, Lyndon Johnson, it was the Castro connection. Johnson never told the public. Because if Cuba and the Soviet Union had ordered the assassination of an American president, that was an act of war. The Warren Commission concluded, lone gunman, case closed. For 60 years, most of America believed them. Now, what if Kennedy had not worn the brace? After Oswald's first bullet, he falls forward, out of the line of fire. The motorcade accelerates. The second shot misses. By December 1963, the President of the United States is recovering in Bethesda Naval Hospital. And the world is about to change in ways no historian has fully dared to imagine. Let's start with the question that haunts every serious historian of this era. Would America have gone to war in Vietnam? Here is what we know. On October 11, 1963, 6 weeks before Dallas, Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum 263. It ordered the withdrawal of 1,000 American military advisors from South Vietnam by the end of the year. He told his advisors privately, I will not send American boys to fight in an Asian war. Lyndon Johnson reversed that order within weeks of taking office. I will not lose Vietnam, he told aides 2 days after Kennedy's death. By 1968, over 500,000 American soldiers were in Southeast Asia. 58,000 of them never came home. In a world where Kennedy lives, that war does not happen the way it did. A phased withdrawal, an exit before the full escalation. The draft never reaches its terrible peak. No mass draft, no draft riots, no My Lai massacre, no generation of young Americans broken by Southeast Asian jungles. The 1960s, one of the most traumatic decades in American history, looks completely different. But Vietnam is not the only powder keg Kennedy was managing. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev had begun exchanging secret, personal letters, bypassing their own governments entirely. They were building something, a path toward reducing nuclear arsenals. In a world where Kennedy survives, that process accelerates. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 becomes the foundation for something larger. The arms race slows. And Cuba? In November 1963, an American journalist named William Atwood was quietly meeting with Cuban officials. Back-channel negotiations. Kennedy was open to normalization of relations with Castro. In a world where he lives, the 50-year American embargo on Cuba might never have happened. The Cold War might have ended 20 years earlier. But here is where history gets uncomfortable. Because Kennedy surviving Dallas does not mean Kennedy succeeds. By late 1963, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had assembled a file on the President of the United States that could end any political career. The affairs, the mob connections, the secret medical history. Judith Campbell, moving packages between the White House and the Chicago Mafia. Hoover had controlled presidents with information like this for 40 years, and Kennedy knew it. In a world where Kennedy survives, these secrets do not stay secret forever. By 1966-1967, a press emboldened by Vietnam begins asking questions. Senate hearings, congressional investigations. Some historians believe Kennedy's second term ends in impeachment. The man who might have stopped the Vietnam War, brought down by the same shadows that followed him into the Oval Office. And now, the part no one talks about. The assassination did something that no presidency could have done. It froze John F. Kennedy, at 46 years old, at his most mythological moment. Young, handsome, surrounded by Jackie, by children, by the image of Camelot, a bright kingdom cut short before its flaws could show. Death made him eternal. But consider this. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most important piece of civil rights legislation in American history, was not passed by Kennedy. It was passed by Lyndon Johnson. Johnson, driven by guilt, by grief, by the crushing weight of a dead president's legacy, pushed through legislation that Kennedy had been too politically cautious to attempt. Kennedy feared losing the southern states. He hesitated. He delayed. It was his murder that gave Johnson the moral authority to act. Think about that. A man whose death did more for justice than his life might have. A legend built not on what he was, but on what we needed him to be. History does not move in straight lines. It does not reward the righteous. It does not punish the corrupt. It does not care about our need for heroes. Sometimes, a bedroom injury leads to a back brace, leads to 5.6 seconds, leads to the end of the most powerful man on earth. And sometimes, a man's death creates the very world he dreamed of building. A myth is always more powerful than a man. JFK alive might have been a flawed, scandalized, possibly impeached president remembered for what he failed to do. JFK dead became the symbol of everything America wanted to believe about itself. The question was never, what if Kennedy had lived? The real question is, what does it say about us that we needed him to die? History is not a story of great men making great decisions. It is a story of small moments. A laced corset, a re-injured back, a 5-second window that accidentally change everything. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all.